Jim's going to be talking about, as we see here, regionalism, patriotism, and the song of a divided nation. This talk will feature live performances. His wife Jennifer will be singing Maryland, Oh Maryland for us, accompanied by Jason Holmes, the director of our gospel choir. And we'll also have men from the University of Rochester Men's Glee Club to sing a song that you will hear the importance of when Jim gives the paper. I just want to acknowledge the names of those guys right now. We're hearing from Kyle Gritelli, Cordero Martinez, George Bastedo, Ian Lawrence, Terrence Dolan, Ian Pershing, Jason Russell, and Ben Walsh, all under the direction of our Men's Glee Club director, Harold McAuliffe. By the way, if you want to hear about the Choral Extravaganza we have coming up in Pittsburgh later this month, I'm sure Harold has got some brochures or something, or flyers or something to hand out. It's going to be a fantastic concert. Let me tell you a little bit about James Davis here. Jim is a professor of musicology and chair of musicology area at the School of Music at State University of New York at Fredonia. His primary research focuses on the music and musicians of the American Civil War. He's also worked in the areas of music history, pedagogy, American popular music of the 19th and 20th century, and the history of bands. He's given papers at all of the major conferences and published plenty of articles. He's got a book. Is the book that you mentioned on your website, is that published yet? Out? Ready?
Which one?
Recently completed book featuring transcriptions of
that came out. That came out last year.
Fantastic. So there's another one in the works that deals with the daily life of soldiers.
Right.
So this guy's very, very busy. One of the world's leading authorities on American music, popular music in the 19th century. So it's fantastic to have him here. It's especially fantastic to have him here because, to the best of my knowledge, we haven't had a lot of engagement between our two departments here at the University of Rochester and SUNY Fredonia. So I hope this is the beginning of what will be a strong relationship between our two departments. I know you have maybe one or two students who studied with you. I know one guy in particular who's going to be here. So it's fantastic to have you here, Jim. Without any further ado, let's welcome Jim Davis.
I am not at this point planning on using a microphone. Can you hear me fairly well? Sweet. If you can't, let me know. Make barnyard sounds or leave. Thank you, John, for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm glad you didn't point out that I'm one of the only specialists in Civil War music, but it sounded good anyway. And also thanks to the Institute for Popular Music and the University of Rochester for having me up here. Very excited that the Institute has gotten going, and I'm just very pleased to be a part of this first year. Dixie, Battle Hymn of the Republic, the Bonnie Blue Flag, the well-known patriotic anthems of the American Civil War. The inspirational meaning or usage of such pieces seems self-evident to many. Certainly this is how such music has been handled. A quick look through traditional histories of the war will find passing references to such iconic works to bolster some colorful point or to add spice to a dry narrative. For a musicologist, this is both frustrating and unfortunate. Frustrating, in that were I to make a similar assumption about the war to military historians, if, for example, I were to say, well, we all know the war is about slavery, what's the big deal? Then I would probably get a tongue lashing that would make even Joan Rivers blush. It is also unfortunate because there is a wealth of musical and extra-musical information to be pulled from contemporary accounts regarding the music produced and consumed during the war. To take such songs at face value is to make a number of dangerous assumptions. In particular, that what later generations conveniently called popular music means that it was popular for all people through the entire war. And that patriotism was an easily defined, stable, and commonly held attitude shared by those living within clearly delineated geopolitical boundaries. There may be no better example than the song Maryland, My Maryland, often considered one of the most popular Confederate patriotic songs. The genesis and reception of Maryland, My Maryland is stocked with ironic contradictions that draw attention to the painful and often irrational actions and belief that were both cause and effect of the war. For example, Maryland, My Maryland was written in Louisiana, not Maryland, and it was conceived of as a poem, not as lyrics. Its belligerent and romanticized words were set to a college glee in 3/4 that was first conscripted as a martial tune, then became popular as a Christmas carol after the war. And most telling of all, it was adopted as one of a handful of Southern anthems, even though it celebrated a state that never joined the Confederacy. These ironies are tangible manifestations of some of the most important issues underlying the war in general. The geographic specificity of the song's lyrics allowed the contest between regional and national loyalties to be fought on bandstands as well as battlefields. This in turn amplified the emerging division between soldiers and civilians as audiences and their role in bestowing musical meaning. And finally, Maryland, My Maryland contributed to the shift in patriotic allegiance from a specific, localized, and material place to an ambiguous, inclusive, and imagined space. Maryland suffered all the confusion and conflict one expects with a border state during the Civil War. Maryland was the northernmost slave state. Worse still, it surrounded Washington, D.C., the political, if not physical, heart of the Union. In addition, Maryland separated Pennsylvania from Virginia, two of the most committed states to their respective countries. No matter where their allegiance might fall, Marylanders knew that their state would be ground under the tread of marching soldiers. In 1860, the Maryland legislature voiced its interest in joining with the other southern states should the Union be dissolved, though they were not in session when South Carolina seceded, and Governor Thomas Holliday Hicks was hesitant to call a special session that might result in a secession vote. Eventually, Lincoln would suspend the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland and move Union troops into the state, so that when the vote was finally placed before the Maryland legislature, they chose to remain in the Union. Not surprising. Not only was Maryland surrounded by competing forces, the state suffered internal discord as well. The eastern shore sided more with the South, while the western counties leaned more towards the Union. In some cases, towns were divided into hostile camps. Maryland eventually supplied regiments to both the Union and Confederate armies. Two major events, the Riot of 1861 and the Battle of Antietam, would ignite the issues surrounding Maryland's tortured role in the war and stamp inescapable associations onto the people of Maryland, the state itself, and eventually the song. By 1861, Maryland's volatile ambiguity was a major concern for both the North and South. Journalists from both sides debated the state's loyalty, and private citizens anxiously watched to see where Maryland would commit. In a move to stabilize the crisis, Lincoln appointed Montgomery Blair of Maryland to be his postmaster general. Yet, rumors of an assassination attempt led Lincoln to pass through Baltimore without stopping on the way to his inauguration, a decision ridiculed by many Southerners. The tension finally erupted on April 19, 1861, when soldiers of the 6th Massachusetts Infantry were attacked by Baltimore civilians as the regiment attempted to catch a train to Washington, D.C. Piles of rubble and uprooted tracks forced the Federals to march down Pratt Street, where pro-Confederate mobs eventually surrounded the recruits, throwing bricks and firing shots, until the soldiers retaliated with shots of their own. 4 Massachusetts soldiers and 12 civilians were killed before the soldiers reached safety. News of the riots swept through North and South with incendiary effect. Northerners were shocked and enraged by the bloody attack, while Southerners praised the courage of the Baltimoreans. The Union could not help but question Maryland's loyalty, while the South eagerly awaited the state's re-entry into the Confederacy. James Ryder Randall, a loyal Marylander currently teaching English literature at a small college in Louisiana, was stunned and angered by the news. Such was his passion that he produced a poem, My Maryland, that lamented Maryland's suffering and pled for her to join the Confederacy. On April 20th, using chivalric imagery laden with religious overtones to imply moral approbation for the Southern cause. It is not surprising that Randall's lyrics exhibit a number of parallels with Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner. Not only had the Star-Spangled Banner attained the status of unofficial national anthem, but Key was a native of Maryland, and his lyric described the assault on Fort McHenry in the Chesapeake Bay, just as Randall was addressing the fighting in Baltimore. Locating the lyric in both time and place, the riot-induced patriotic gore on the streets of Baltimore is both the strength and weakness of the lyric. Celebrating such a sensational event in music attracts those who were most affected by the riot, or who feel they have the most at stake with the riot's aftermath. It also serves as journalism of a sort, relating contemporary events to a national audience, albeit with much poetic license. On the other hand, such topical specificity can limit the appeal and longevity of the song. The shock value eventually wears off, and newer events eclipse the riot and Maryland's plight in general. Of course, by mourning the blood of Marylanders and not that of the soldiers killed in the riot, the song holds no current or subsequent appeal for Unionists. Maryland is referred to as a woman throughout the lyrics, and her foe is invariably masculine. Such imagery was predictable, as discussions of patriotism and statehood were often couched in terms of gender and relationships. Yet the conflict between genders here is telling, in that he is not the Union, nor any abstract entity such as Maryland herself. But in fact, he is President Lincoln. The despot's heel and tyrant's chain are unambiguous references to Lincoln and his abuse of civil liberties. What is also unique is the presence of so many faces of woman: warrior, sister, mother, companion to Lady Liberty, and even blushing maiden. Randall drew upon all aspects of feminine strength and appeal. This may have been done for commercial reasons, as such imagery was commonplace and expected by contemporary readers. But it is also possible that he comes to his gendered patriotism honestly, in that he uses this imagery to simultaneously reach backward and forward in time, to handle the paradoxical pursuit of peace through war, and to encourage a balanced perception of Maryland as victim and savior. The end product is somewhat confusing, a combination of real technique alongside hasty pretentiousness. There are powerful images alongside predictable metaphors. There are creative uses of assonance and internal rhymes, followed by forced end rhymes. The whole comes off as bombastic and grandiose, yet there is an effective genuineness that is difficult to deny. The result is a poem that blurs the line between war art and propaganda. The language and structure are elevated, while the meaning and intention are pleading. In a sense, medium and message are almost at odds. The music chosen to convey Randall's words is in some ways more intriguing than the poem itself. While modern ears hear Maryland, My Maryland as sharing the tune of O Christmas Tree, such was not the case during the war. To begin with, O Christmas Tree, the translation of the German carol O Tannenbaum, was not as prevalent in mid-19th century America as it is today. And O Tannenbaum itself was known more as a song sung by German Americans than as a household holiday tune. Indeed, the commonly known words to O Tannenbaum were only written in 1824. More important, however, is that many, if not most of those who describe the music during the war cite the Latin song Laudator Horatius as the source for the tune of Maryland, My Maryland. Laudator Horatius is a Latin student song that shares the melody of O Tannenbaum and most likely dates from the late 18th century. Now it's a real pleasure to turn this over to the men of the Glee Club, University of Rochester Glee Club, so we can hear this song as it was originally meant to be.
Horatius, condiscisti verum, fugitur officius, tempus et ad verum, homini sunt popula, nutriora mele, brix et pax et oscula, tentis muere.
Thank you very much, guys. College songs were well known in certain segments of American society at this time, so it is not surprising that many heard Labrador Horatius and not O Tannenbaum as the musical source for Maryland, My Maryland. In addition, though the melodic ideas are the same between each of these pieces, the phrase structure of Maryland, My Maryland is the same as Labrador Horatius, AABA, that is a rounded binary, whereas the phrase structure of O Tannenbaum is ternary, ABA. There are other factors that would have made Labrador Horatius a likely candidate for a patriotic tune. The text and music start firmly on a downbeat, making it much more like a march, whereas O Tannenbaum starts more gently with an anacrusis. Finally, it is likely that the Carey sisters heard Labrador Horatius performed by young men at parties during serenades. The combination of a male chorus and an unfamiliar Latin text could predispose the audience to hear Labrador Horatius as somewhat martial as opposed to the more lyrical O Tannenbaum sung by a soloist or mixed ensemble. So here is the result of the Carey sisters' efforts. My wonderful wife Jennifer will now give us a few verses. Anybody was following the text of the poem, you'll notice there was one change. In the second verse, first line, Randall had originally said exiled son, but when the song got converted, it became wondering. Thank you very much. From a historical or performance practice standpoint, this song, I believe, is caught, if you will, between two personas. In a sense, the two personas of the Latin song versus the potential Christmas carol, O Tannenbaum. For example, if you look at the dotted rhythms that open the song, they imply a martial or march-like character. But immediately after that, when the voice comes in, the piano switches to straight eighth notes, something that is much more in line with a parlor ballad of the time. Along this line, when I was doing this research, I spent a fair amount of time scanning CDs looking for modern performance of this song, and I found some very interesting things. To begin with, not many people record this song. There's no denying that Maryland, My Maryland is one of the principal songs of the Civil War, but a lot of artists choose not to do that. And I would argue that it might be very well because of this tension, if you will. Those who do perform it tend to take its character one way or the other, and it's almost as if you have to. Half of them sing it very rigid, very aggressive. They emphasize the dotted rhythms. The other half do the exact opposite. They flatten out the dots. They turn the melody very lyrical. It's like you have these two personas, and it's hard to figure out which way it's supposed to go. At least that's the case for modern performers, I would argue. Despite my quibbling, the melody of Laureus Horatius or O Tannenbaum, whichever you prefer, was by most accounts accepted as a suitable vehicle for a patriotic song during the Civil War. It should be noted, though, that even from the start, many listeners made a distinction between the original tune, whichever it was, and the subsequent song. For example, here's what John Mills of New York had to say after hearing a performance of Maryland, My Maryland in May of 1862. But the words aren't very bad, and the music makes you forget them, for the air is really grand. O Tannenbaum is a song familiar to many Germans, but the words of My Maryland, without the air, are anything but good. This soldier's willingness to separate the lyric-burdened song from the original tune reveals an embryonic distinction between soldier and civilian reactions to both the instrumental and vocal versions that will prove to be critical to the song's reception. Maryland, My Maryland was not the only poem cum song that appeared following the violence in Baltimore, though it was surely the most popular. There was Downtrodden Maryland, sung to the tune of Tom Bowling. This is example 2 on your handout, if you'd like to see it a little better. This was released in Baltimore in November of 1861, with lyrics surprisingly similar in tone and intent to Randall's verses. Example 3 is the much less presumptuous Camp Song of the Maryland Line, released as a broadside in 1861 and sung to the tune Gan Happy or Free and Easy. Clearly the first is better suited to civilian tastes, while the second would have been favored by soldiers in the field. As an aside, it should also be noted that the events in Maryland were not the only impetus for aspiring songwriters. Indeed, both the North and South knew the power that a patriotic anthem held over the people, and both sides took measures to produce a new national anthem. In the North, this led to the formation of the National Hymn Committee, a group of politicians, business leaders, and others who put out a call for a new national anthem, then weeded through over 1,200 hopeful contenders. As you might imagine, the pool included a frightening range of musical accomplishments. And the results of the deliberations? The committee decided that none of the submissions were suitable. In fact, the chair of the committee, Richard Grant White, published the committee's findings, and the title of his book is rather aptly named. It summarizes the entire process. For those of you that might not be able to see how they are written and how they are not written. Humor aside, this somewhat amusing situation draws necessary attention to the musical awareness and sensitivity of mid-century Americans. The significance of patriotic music was not entirely providential. Soldiers and civilians both were very conscious of music's power and took a vested interest in what they performed and listened to. For the first half of 1862, Maryland, My Maryland fulfilled its most obvious purpose as propaganda and as a popular song, especially when armies were operating in or near the state's borders. Soldiers as well as civilians quickly embraced the song and or the tune. Randolph McKim claimed that Maryland, My Maryland was often the first song sung around the campfire each night by members of the 1st Maryland Confederate Infantry, while Officer McHenry Howard noticed that a newly formed regimental band began rehearsing Maryland, My Maryland as early as January of 1862. Not only was Maryland, My Maryland proving to be aesthetically appealing, it quickly accrued patriotic baggage as well. One evening in 1862, a Union colonel hosted a party for the locals of Frederick, Maryland. The soldiers began to sing Northern patriotic tunes that grated on the ears of Confederate sympathizers. Harriet Floyd and her friends, living next door to the party, decided to provide music of the opposing inclination, and quickly the piano trumpeted Maryland, My Maryland, along with other similar songs. The performance was interrupted by the appearance of a Union officer at their door who, according to Harriet, demanded the names of all present, telling us we must consider ourselves under arrest for insulting our loyal neighbors by singing secession songs. By mid-1862, Maryland, My Maryland appeared ready to assume the mantle of a regional, if not national, patriotic anthem. The events of September 1862 drastically altered the song's trajectory and generated a new cloud of doubt surrounding the song and the state. In September of 1862, Robert E. Lee began his Maryland campaign, a bold move into the North that, if successful, would seriously undermine Union morale and pressure the Union's leadership into negotiations to end the war. As they first approached the Maryland border, Confederate troops sang and laughed. Innumerable accounts note that it was Maryland, My Maryland that brass bands played as the troops waded across the Potomac. The approaching battle on Maryland soil encouraged the song's inspirational and associative power for Confederate soldiers. Sustaining this new intensity required a major victory, however, and this was not to be. In the bloodiest day in American history, George McClellan's Army of the Potomac met the Army of Northern Virginia at the small town of Sharpsburg, shutting down the Confederate advance and forcing Lee to retreat back to Virginia. To make matters worse, Confederate soldiers were shocked to find as many Unionists in Maryland as there were Southern sympathizers. Many of the men had bought into Randall's portrayal of the Confederate Army as liberators for the enslaved state. Upon recrossing the Potomac, some Confederate band leaders sought to bolster spirits by playing patriotic tunes. Many were surprised, however, to find that Maryland, My Maryland was now met with derision. According to Walter Taylor of Virginia, quote, "One of the bands commenced the air My Maryland and was prevented from proceeding by the groans and hisses of the soldiers. This will convey to you some idea of the effect of the recent invasion upon the sentiments of the army concerning the people of that unfortunate state." Close quote. Captain Greenlee Davidson was more than willing to replace Maryland, My Maryland with a song that spoke of a return to his native Virginia. Quote, "For my part, I have enough of Maryland. I don't want to hear anything more of Maryland, My Maryland. When I came in sight of the Potomac, I felt like singing, 'Oh, carry me back to old Virginia.'" At this moment, it would appear as if ownership of the song was up for grabs. Walter Taylor, frustrated by the defeat and disgusted with his army's lukewarm reception in Maryland, told his family at home, "Don't let any of your friends sing My Maryland." On the Union side, John Harrison Mills of New York announced that My Maryland was now sung by Union soldiers, while the soldiers from Massachusetts incorrectly boasted that Maryland, My Maryland was ever after a Union song. Such a claim was hasty, to say the least, as the lyric and admittedly brief history of Maryland, My Maryland had already marked it as Confederate. But the recent events in Maryland would forever color how the song was received by soldiers on both sides of the conflict. As James D. Nance of South Carolina observed, quote, "One thing is very sure, the soldier sings Maryland, My Maryland with far less zest than heretofore." Close quote. Northern civilians, on the other hand, gleefully leapt on the song following the news of the defeat of Lee's army. The October 11 issue of Harper's Weekly published a scathing parody of Randall's verses. This is example number 4 on your handout. You might note that while these verses are obviously hostile to the Confederacy, they are not necessarily favorable towards Maryland. Not to be left off the bandwagon, the Boston publisher Oliver Ditson released a unionized version of Maryland, My Maryland. This is example 5. And a friendly word of warning, if you had trouble wrapping your mind around Randall's words fitting with "Oh Christmas Tree," then you're really going to have great fun trying to sing these words with the tune. Even as Confederate soldiers grew suspicious of the song, Southern civilians, unaware of and incapable of understanding the colossal and bloody clash at Antietam, still heard Maryland, My Maryland as a glorious referent of Confederate unity. The 14-year-old Ellen Saunders of Georgia not only replaced the physical state with the metaphoric song, but then fantasized that the lyrics were actually reenacted. Quote, "Stonewall Jackson and his brave men are in Maryland, My Maryland. The mobile cadets were the first to cross the Potomac. And when they were all over, General Jackson, at the head of his troops, prayed that the chains of Maryland might soon be riven and the Confederate flag shield her evermore from the touch of the despot. And the soldiers knelt and kissed the soil of Maryland, brave Maryland. For civilians like Ellen, such poetic visions were a key step in uplifting Randall's already hyperbolic imagery into the realm of the mythic. Slowly but surely, the material state was being replaced by an allegorical apparition. While Maryland was being elevated into a symbol of oppression, the citizens of Maryland were gaining a much less admirable reputation. Sally Putnam of Richmond wrote of a recently passed congressional bill that conscripted expatriate Marylanders into the Confederate Army. Though sympathetic to Maryland's plight, she recorded another parody that is anything but sympathetic to Marylanders living in Virginia. This is example 6 on your handout. The failure of Maryland to leave the Union and the loss of a major battle on Maryland soil could have pushed the song out of the Confederacy's repertoire. This was not the case, however. The mythologizing of Maryland's plight, the separation of the vocal song from the instrumental tune, and the continuing renovation of patriotic commitment meant that Maryland, My Maryland continued to sound in parlors and campgrounds, though it still had to face some additional transformations. On June 20th, feisty West Virginia became the 35th state in the Union, symbolically and geographically pushing Maryland deeper into the Union. About the same time, Robert E. Lee again moved his forces north for what would eventually result in the Battle of Gettysburg. Union and Confederate soldiers again recorded encountering both northern and southern sympathies as they passed through the state, though there was little idealism surrounding this march through Maryland. Now, it was simply a place to pass through on the way to a real northern state. Maryland, My Maryland still managed to play a part in the invasion, however. A member of the 38th Georgia Infantry recalled bands playing the tune as they left the Shenandoah Valley on their way north towards Pennsylvania. Of course, following the Confederate loss at Gettysburg and the second hurried retreat across the Potomac, Southern morale and any perspectives on Maryland and its song reached an all-time low. Following the battle, one soldier recalled singing a parody of Maryland, My Maryland as they returned to Virginia. This is example 7 on the handout. And I would ask that you note the similarities to the previous parody. Obviously, soldiers and civilians were able to exchange rewrites of the tune. And finally, I direct you to example 8. The irrepressible and musically inclined Confederate General Jeb Stuart went so far as to craft a parody of the song in honor of his horse, which he had named My Maryland in honor of the Maryland troops who had given him the horse. I must share with you one of those moments only scholars can appreciate. I think this is a picture of the horse. I found this image from the London Illustrated, and it was a etching done of Stuart at Gettysburg. So, in theory, this is the horse, My Maryland. I'm just so excited. Sorry. Obviously, the almost sacred nature of Randall's lyrics was giving way to a more mundane and realistic perspective for soldiers. Such was not the case for civilians, however. Julia LeGrand, a native Marylander whose family had relocated to Louisiana, told her journal of reading an article by Oliver Wendell Holmes in which he described Maryland as a state loyal to the Union. LeGrand adamantly rejected this claim, though a few days later she revisited these thoughts. The strains of Randall's lyrics eventually enter her monologue, leading her to admit that Maryland was wrong for not joining the Confederacy and somewhat deserving of the insults bandied about Southern parlors. Yet this distrust slowly gave way to a different perspective. Quote, "She has been much sympathized with and pitied, and Maryland, My Maryland has been sung with real and earnest pathos by thousands of Southern lips. They thought she was true, that she would come with us someday when her chains were taken off." LeGrand's rhetoric unconsciously uncovered a notion that explains the ironic yet enduring popularity of Maryland, My Maryland. Quote, Now that she is the battlefield, bleeding, dismantled, and torn, she is loved. Close quote. Shifting from a beacon of Southern nobility to a symbol of gallant suffering, Maryland remained useful to Confederate propaganda, ignoring the fact that the image of political bondage and chains required a massive blindness to the literal bondage that had provoked the war. Legrand's candid musings show that the mythologizing of Maryland, unintentionally begun with Randall's poem, had come to fruition. For civilians, what now happened in the state mattered little. It was what the state represented that was of value. This shift from the place known as Maryland to the patriotic space of Maryland's martyrdom allowed Randall's words to continue functioning, but only for those who were not involved in the fighting in Maryland. Soldiers, intimate with the horrors of the war and the truth of the fighting in Maryland, were little inclined to celebrate either Maryland or the state's tragedy as portrayed in the lyrics. This attitude was augmented by a different way of hearing based on occupational perspective. In short, civilians were exposed more to the vocal version, the song, while soldiers experienced the instrumental version, the tune. Civilians sang and heard the words to Maryland, My Maryland, while soldiers listened and marched to the tune. While the song portrayed an imagined patriotic space for civilians, the tune, played by a regimental band, symbolized the lived military community of the soldier. As 1864 came to a close, Maryland, My Maryland had one more noteworthy transformation to endure before the war would end, as instrumental versions of the tune began appearing in Union band books. In yet another extreme instance of irony, the band of the 87th Pennsylvania played Maryland, My Maryland on their way from the siege of Petersburg, Virginia, to fight at the Battle of Monocacy in Maryland. Now we have a Union regiment playing the tune as they cross the Potomac, heading north to fight on Maryland's soil. By 1865, issues of Maryland's place in the Union, its relationship with the Confederacy, and the loyalty of its citizens had drifted into the background. For some civilians, however, the end of the war did not diminish the divisiveness inherent in the song's lyrics. Homer Sprague of Connecticut discovered that some Southerners still wielded Randall's verses as a weapon against their hated foes, even after the end of the war. Sprague told of a humorous encounter he and his comrades experienced outside of Augusta, Georgia, in May 1865. Quote, "A number of officers visited one of the fine residences and were entertained by several ladies with songs and instrumental music. One, more demonstrative than the rest, sang Maryland, My Maryland with extraordinary gusto. Concluding, she turned to Dr. Clark and said to that urbane gentleman in a snappish way, 'I suppose that makes you mad, don't it?' To which the doctor retorted with provoking coolness, 'Oh no, we don't care what you sing as long as we can whip you.' She immediately rejoined, 'We're not whipped, we're only overpowered.'" Decades following the surrender at Appomattox, Maryland, My Maryland would join other icons of the war in a brief period of hibernation, then awaken to a new phase of popularity as the war was mythologized and its veterans received regional and national commemoration. Civil War music became increasingly bipartisan. Some songs, Marching Through Georgia, for example, retained enough sectional patriotism as to keep them from moving past their original contentious purpose. Yet a surprising number of songs were detached from their original regional or national patriotism, instead coming to symbolize the military community shared by the men, not the countries for which they had fought. By no means was the song's appeal limited to veterans, or even those from Maryland or the Eastern Seaboard. The Georgia chapters of the Daughters of the Confederacy used Maryland, My Maryland to open their celebrations in Atlanta on November 9th of 1895. And as a fitting end to this tale, Maryland adopted the providential tune and lyrics as their state song in 1939. By mid-century, as you can tell from the sheet music on the screen, Maryland, My Maryland had grown from a regional song to a Confederate hymn and finally into an American anthem. Looking back on the tempestuous reception of Maryland, My Maryland, I would argue that this song experienced the proverbial perfect storm in terms of the events surrounding its creation and immediate distribution. The fervor attached to all things Maryland following the riot proved a golden opportunity for a new piece to ride a wave of sensationalism. That the melody was already known simply added to the speed with which it was accepted. Transferring the tune into bandbooks allowed the melody to continue its own newly redefined trajectory, even as the lyrics began to lose currency for Southern patriots. A flexible, unformed notion of patriotism likewise fueled the song's success. At the start of the war, regional loyalty and national patriotism worked hand in hand, with one often substituting for the other within a given rhetorical situation. Subsequent developments may have detached regionalism from patriotism, but by that point, Maryland, My Maryland had already entered the canon. It became less a matter of making the song popular and more one of adjusting perspective to validate the song's message. In addition, the required alterations to the song's reception reveals an intriguing shift in the construction of patriotic musical space. Randall's words and the Careys' conversion of his poem into a song designated a place, the state of Maryland and its people. This musical and material place had immediate and intimate connotations for those living and fighting within Maryland's borders. Even for those not physically present in or near Maryland, the song denoted a real place. Yet after the failure of the state or its population to join the Confederacy, the song grew increasingly divorced from the state, and Maryland, both the state and the song, became a metonymic space, an idealized, even fictional entity that served as a symbolic martyr for the Southern cause. This allowed civilians to retain the song in their patriotic pantheon, even as the state and its people became objects of scorn. In fact, many listeners cared little for what happened in the real state, preferring instead the imagined realm of the song's metaphorical land of suffering. The turbulent reception history of Maryland, My Maryland indicates how regionalism, patriotism, and music were adaptable notions that continually intersected and influenced each other. More important, the mixed and changing response to the song shows how a static view of any of these factors ignores the fluidity of the situation, not only in terms of the intended meaning of a socio-political concept or a song's lyric, but also in how both patriotic commitment and musical reception could be redirected given the right set of circumstances. Maryland, My Maryland was not simply a regional artifact, or a national anthem, or a patriotic tune, or a commercial song. It was all of these things, and recognizing the interdependence of each on the other is a necessary step in understanding how music actively shaped patriotic commitment and directly contributed to the renovation of personal and national identity during the American Civil War. Thank you.
That was fantastic. If I can just take the chair's prerogative for just a minute and comment that, and especially for the students in the room, the situation is as if somebody took a Beatles song like Let It Be, that everybody knew, and started to change the lyrics and actually bring those out as songs. So imagine we had people in Congress fighting over the budget or something like that. The Democrats put new words to Let It Be, and the Republicans put new words to Let It Be, and the Independents or the Libertarians, and they're sort of shooting back and forth at each other. And it seems to me that, and maybe my colleague Kim Kowalski can think of other instances in the 20th century, I find it very difficult to think of a tune that has gone through these kinds of reuses. The closest, I mean, imagine maybe Paul Simon using the Bach piece for an American song. There's one instance I can think of, but not too many. And it seems to me that this is probably because copyright law makes it impossible in the last 100 years to really redo a song that way. I mean, we think about the Beach Boys doing Surfin' USA and that being Chuck Berry's Sweet Little 16, but that wasn't without a lawsuit from Chuck Berry to get paid for the original song. So, in fact, this kind of thing is very much discouraged by current copyright law, but when it happens in the 19th century like this, and as you've so expertly pointed out, it's a fascinating study of how music can have such a strong identity that taking a song like this and changing the lyrics can have really important meaning for people. And I guess it just underlies the fact that popular music, whether it's in the 19th century or the 20th century, can be an extremely important vehicle of identity for the people who are involved in it. So it's a fascinating study. Okay, I'll shut up now. Questions? Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks for your paper. It's fascinating. I was surprised you didn't mention Abraham, my Abraham, which I find to be we understand to be the most, I don't know, to sort of be the winner out of all this, at least from my reading of Bowman. Is that right?
Winner in terms of popularity?
Is there popularity coming out of all this, that Abraham is really the takes off?
After the war?
Yeah. Or at the end and after?
After the war, I would say, yeah. Okay, fine, yeah. Maryland, My Maryland is consigned after the war. It becomes a possession of the veterans, the Civil War veterans. I mean, they own it. So something like Abraham, My Abraham, sure. That will go, I would assume, gets much more general distribution. And then until, of course, the state adopts it for the national, for their state anthem.
When we talk about this being popular, how many copies of these various editions were printed and sold? Do we have any idea?
Not much. Some information, for example, almost none for southern imprints, because the southern presses, well, 3/4 of them were destroyed in the course of the war. So all the paperwork, all the whatnot was lost. The northern presses did not keep paperwork like we would have preferred they keep for our records. So there's only speculation. I think that's an interesting question, though. If I may add to that, my Civil War class, we just got done reading some stuff like Paul Charsh's early stuff on 19th century popular song. And we were reminded how even sales of the sheet music don't indicate its full popularity, because you can't take into account the broadsides. How many of those broadsides were released? My gosh, 4, 5, 10 times as many as the sheet music, and those are consumed even quicker. So it's so hard to get a feel for how many of these were out there. I know that some folks who have worked in this field spend a lot of time on reprints and stolen prints as a means of gauging a song's popularity. So for example, Maryland, My Maryland, when Blackmore's press was burned in New Orleans, they reopened in Augusta, Georgia within 6 months, and guess what? One of the first pieces they did was Maryland, My Maryland, which is a good indication that it was on the top of their selling list.
They didn't have records or radio back then, so the primary source for people to hear these songs and absorb them was live concerts, I'm assuming. So if there were all these different versions, there must have been a lot of different concerts. And people, I mean, how did they get popular? Was the sheet music just handed out and people played it?
The broadsides would be handed out. The sheet music would be purchased. And most of this stuff, like Maryland, the sheet music I showed you, was for home consumption, not necessarily concert consumption. The point was to get the sheet music at the piano at home, and the family would gather and sing it. And that in itself was enough to trigger it. Certain songs, Maryland, My Maryland is one, but songs like the Battle Hymn of the Republic were actually made famous through star performers. That the Hutchinson family or somebody would adopt a tune and then perform it, and that would build its base. But songs like these, it was almost literally word of mouth from parlor to parlor.
Did anybody like a Jenny Lind get behind a song like this?
No, most of them were avoiding the country at the time. Nobody wanted to be bobbing around. Gottschalk, the singers didn't. There were a number of pianists, though, who toured even during the war. But most of them were quite grumpy because the audiences kept requesting tunes like Maryland, My Maryland. They wanted to play Chopin. Like, what's the problem? But no, most of it was amateur. Sir.
It's a very long song. I wonder when the Confederate civilians were singing this, we know if there are any verses that were more popular, more regularly sung than others?
That's a really neat question. I can't answer in terms of the verse, but you know what you can do is you can track lines cited in letters and diaries. There are definitely certain phrases that were extremely popular.
Right. That was my second question. And do we know which ones those are? I imagine some of them kind of jump off the page. Some are much more kind of
My hunch
southern
is,
nationalistic.
my hunch is we'd agree on them just looking at it. But you even heard in my paper tonight, some of the quotes I did. Very effective use of embedding the lyric in a letter, in a diary entry, and yeah, they are kind of predictable. And they're also the easier ones to say usually.
Jim, we have a question from the internet.
Hi, I'm the internet.
Okay, Jason is the internet, member of the internet gate. So Jason.
This comes from student from the internet.
Is it one of you guys?
The question is, what issues arise from the use of the lyrics by the state of Maryland when they adopt it as the state song in the mid-20th century?
I will be very honest, I haven't followed this up.
And if you could restate the question for the internet so they can,
Okay,
more or less.
if I heard correctly, what issues surround the adoption of the song and the lyrics by the state of Maryland? I will be very honest, I have not pursued this. I know the issues out there, but time is fleeting. I do know that there were issues when it was first adopted, that there was concern that by picking this song we are professing allegiance to the old Confederacy and whatnot. I will add as well that those issues have not gone away. That, again, from what little I know, every 5 to 10 years, the issue comes before the legislature. Somebody brings it up again. We got to cut this lyric. We have to cut this verse. We should rewrite this. It goes into debate. People and the state gets behind it. Yeah, it is. I would say it's still an issue for Marylanders. Understandable. Great. Sir.
I believe the song is still played when horses come to the post for the Preakness Stakes
Really?
out at Pimlico
I didn't know that.
every year.
I didn't know that.
Write that down.
I'm going to write that one down.
That sounds like a great research trip. You should take
Think you or would fund me?
I'm curious, was James Randall aware of like any of the changes that were going on with his original lyrics and the parodies, and if so, did he have any response?
Wouldn't you love to know? When he read some of those parodies, wouldn't you love to know what he read? I've never seen any reference from him in response to it. I can say that he blithely rode the crest of popularity with the song. He was set for life. He's in every American anthology of poetry. He knows it. So he gladly retold the story of the poem again and again and again. But I never heard him reference the parodies. That's a really interesting question. Sir, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to follow up. I'm actually from Maryland, and I have no idea this is our state song. I guess, like, my question is, are the lyrics for the state song the same as the ones that he printed? Because they're pretty inflammatory, and I don't know, at least from my experience growing up there, which is not a lot, but, like, it seems like the Confederate sentiment in Maryland is much less than it is in other places, like at least like Stone Mountain, Georgia, or like you have those kind of remnants are still very prevalent, but in Maryland, it doesn't really seem like that's something that's still there. So it's kind of strange to hear that.
I think one verse has been cut in full. Again, please don't quote me on that, but I think one verse has been cut. But if I can address your second point, I understand what you're saying, that Maryland comes off perhaps as less beholden or anchored to the Old South or the Confederacy. I think you're right, less in terms of the state's attitude, but just sticking within my realm, the song. Maryland keeps fighting to change the song, not because of any Confederate ties, but because it's their bloody song. They're proud of it, they're fiercely proud of it. And many Marylanders, I do believe, don't see Confederate overtones. They see it as the state song. So I think that's an interesting observation. Yeah. Sir.
You mentioned Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, and I'm actually a Virginian. And, well, yeah, we won't talk about that. Anyway, did that song, the Virginia song, kind of follow the same trajectory, or what kind of parallels are there between Maryland, My Maryland, and Carry Me Back to Old Virginia in terms of rewriting lyrics? I know it followed suit with becoming the Virginia state song. And the same every 5 to 10 years, someone says, "Why is this our state song?"
Yeah. To begin with, let's be clear. There are two versions. There's the James Bland version that's going to come later, and then the one that would have been done during the Civil War. Carry Me Back to Old Virginia was not abused as Maryland, My Maryland was, because despite naming a classic Southern state in the lyric, it was seen as a popular song. Carry Me Back to Old Virginia was a song you sung and you danced to. There wasn't a lot of patriotic or nationalistic intent imposed upon it. So you actually find Northerners referring to it, playing around the campfire just as much as Southerners. So it was lucky it didn't carry the baggage that Maryland, My Maryland did. That's a tough one.
Well, on that happy note, let's thank Jim again. And